Hey everyone, welcome to WittCode, where in this video we're going to learn how to log a user into an application using their Google account with Node, Express, and the Google API's NPM library. So as a demonstration of what we're going to build, we can see we've logged in right here, and it has our Google profile picture, our name, and email. If we log out, say this is what it looks like in the entry, which just says welcome to app. If we click login, we get sent through the Google OAuth login route. Of course, we're going to go over what all this means. But so you choose your account, keep going, and after you've logged in, you get sent to this page. We're also going to learn about tokens. So if we look inside our application tab, we have something called an ID token. We're going to go over what that is and how we can use that to implement login. We're also going to go over refresh tokens. So say we delete this ID token and refresh this page, we will get an unauthorized. But what we can do is use a refresh token. So if we go to API auth refresh, we use a refresh token to get a new ID token. And now if we go back to our profile page, we can log in again. So we're going to learn about refresh tokens, ID tokens, and all that. But so before we begin this video, I actually want to go over the flow of this, as it'll make it a lot easier. And I'm also going to go over OAuth 2 and OpenID. So to log in with Google, we need to use Google's OAuth 2 protocol. And so OAuth 2 allows users to share their Google data with our application after they authenticate themselves with Google. After the user logs in with Google, Google will provide us with some tokens that identify the user and allow us to access their Google data. So here are the steps involved. So we have this image over here. Let's go to the beginning. So right here is an index.html page that our server has served up. The user then clicks login with Google, which is that right there. That will send a request to our server, which then redirects this request to Google's auth server, which is this page right here. The user then signs in. So we click through all this, we click sign in. And what happens is then Google redirects to our server with something called an auth code. We send this auth code to Google's auth server, and then the auth server returns us an ID token, access token, and refresh token. Then what we do is we direct the user to the profile page, which is what we see here, and set an ID token, access token, and refresh token as cookies. So if we refresh this page, we can see the ID token right here. The reason the refresh token isn't being shown is because we have more restrictions on it, so it's only sent to certain routes. We'll of course learn about that too. But now every time we send a request to our server, it will contain this ID token for identification, which we can use to log in. So for example, say we go now to the main page, because we have an ID token, it redirects us to the profile page. But so everything we're doing here is the Google OAuth 2 protocol. And we can use Google's OAuth 2 protocol to log users into an application because it conforms to the OpenID Connect specification. And OpenID is a layer on top of OAuth 2 that tells Google to give our application an ID token containing the logged in user's information. So basically we can get an access token to access Google's APIs like Google Drive, things like that. But we can get an ID token because of OpenID Connect that identifies the user. But so now we're going to start with some configuration before we start coding, and we're going to have to do all of this with the Google Cloud Console. And specifically, to use Google's OAuth 2, we need to create authorization credentials to identify our application. And to do this, we need to go to console.cloud.google.com and then the credentials page. I will put this link in the description so you can go there. You might have to create an account with the Google Cloud or something like that, but it's pretty straightforward. But essentially after you've done that, click the link I have in the description for creating credentials. After you've gone here, what you want to do is click Create Credentials, and we want to create an OAuth client ID. After clicking this, if this is your first time, we might need to create an OAuth consent screen. Let me zoom in a bit. So we might have to create an OAuth consent screen. So let's click on Configure Consent Screen, and the first thing we need to do is tell Google who is going to use our application. We have internal and external. External needs to be verified by Google as it's used by people outside our organization, and internal will not need to be verified by Google. It is only available to users within our organization. So choose whichever one of those. I'm going to choose external because we think maybe eventually we would like people outside of our organization to use this. Next, we will have to create an OAuth consent screen right here. And the OAuth consent screen is what is displayed to the user when they are logging in. It will show details such as our app name, our logo, contact information, and things like that. It will also include information such as our application homepage, privacy policy, and terms of service links. So just fill in your app name. For me, I'm going to do just WittCode app, type in your support email, And then I'm not going to have a logo or app domain. And we're also not going to provide an authorized domain, as we'll do this on a later page in here, which you'll see. And then just type in your contact email. Then we'll go to the next page, which is scopes. And so scopes are essentially the data that we want our users to give our application access to. They're divided into different categories, such as non-sensitive, sensitive. So we have non-sensitive, sensitive, and restricted. Sensitive scopes request access to private user data. Non-sensitive request access to public user data. And restricted scopes request access to very sensitive user data. So for this, we're just going to leave our scopes blank by now. Just click Save and Continue. Next, we can add some test users, and these are Google accounts that can access our application before it goes live to the public or is reviewed by Google. So say, for me, I'm just going to add myself, but feel free to add whatever Google account you have access or want to give access to your application before it goes live. Next, just click Save and Continue. And now we can see just a summary of everything we've provided. So just click back to Dashboard. But so now we've got our OAuth consent screen configured. Of course, you can always go back and edit it. But what we need to do now is create an OAuth client ID. So what we need to do is go back to credentials, which is also that URL that I have provided in the description. And we need to click on Create Credentials again. And once again, click OAuth client ID. And now that we have a consent screen, we can go to the next page. And for our application type, we want to create a web application. And then we can just give it a name. Just give it a name for whatever you want. The name here is really for your own use and not for any users that will use your application. But this part is important here. Now we have authorized JavaScript origins and authorized redirect URIs. So JavaScript origins right here are the origins that are allowed to send requests to the Google OAuth 2 server. The redirect URIs are the URIs that our application will redirect to after a user logs in with Google. And so for us, we want our authorized JavaScript origin. For development, we're just going to have it be HTTP localhost port 9001, which is where our application is going to be running. And we want our redirect URI to be HTTP localhost 9001 API auth cookie. Of course, you can configure those to what you want them to be, but if you follow along in this video, these are the ones I'm going to be using. And next, after this, you just need to click Create. And after following these steps, we should get an OAuth client created right here, which consists of a client ID, secret, and creation date. And so the client ID right here is a unique identifier for our application, and the client secret is a unique secret for our application. And note, the client secret is sensitive information, and so it should be kept secret. So I'm actually probably just going to delete these credentials because of this video, but what you want to do is you can download this as a JSON file, but make sure to copy these because we're going to be using these as environment variables, and we're actually going to start doing that right now. So now we can start to code. So I'm going to open up an empty directory just like this, and the first thing we're going to do is create an environment variable file, just called .env, and paste in here, we're going to have our client secret and our client ID. So go back into the Google console, get both of these, and paste them both in here. And now we also want to set some other environment variables, including the location of our Express server, the redirect URI that we set in the Google console, and the domain that we will set our HTTP cookies on that contain our OAuth tokens. So just paste these in like this. So we're on localhost. Our port is going to be 9001. Our redirect URI is 9001-API-auth.cookie, and so on. So make sure these match. This is the redirect URI that we created in the console, and then make sure the host and port also match what we set as our authorized origin. But now let's set up our project. So the first thing we're going to do is initialize this as an npm project by running npm init es6-y. Now we're going to install nodemon as a development dependency to assist us with our development. And next we want to install Express and some Express packages. And these are Express, zoom in one more, Express, Cookie Parser, and Pug. So of course, Express is the web application framework for Node. Cookie Parser, right here, is a middleware for parsing HTTP cookies. Let me actually show these in the package.json. So down here, Cookie Parser is a middleware for parsing HTTP cookies, and we're going to use it to set cookies on the client that house our OAuth tokens. And then we have Pug, which is a template engine for Node, so we can serve up some dynamic pages. And now there's one other library we need to install, and this is because due to the importance of having best security practices when working with Google's OAuth 2, Google strongly suggests using a library that handles a lot of the logic for us. For example, these libraries handle refreshing access tokens, requiring user consent, things like that. And for Node, this library is called Google APIs. So install npmi Google APIs right here. It's version 137, which is kind of crazy, but that's what we're going to be using. And now let's set our project entry point and script. So in this package.json file at the top by main right here, our entry point is going to be source server.js. And we're going to have a start script that will run nodemon on the entry point. And it's also going to provide an env file. So our node env file, or our .env environment variable file. Note that to use this flag right here, you need to use node version 20.11 or higher. So if you're not using that, just use .env or something like that, or just upgrade your node version would probably be the easiest. But now we can start coding. So let's create our entry point now, and it's going to be a server.js file inside our source directory. And so first what we're going to do is create an express server and attach some initial middleware to it. And I'm just going to paste all this in, and then I'm going to go over what it's all doing. So paste in this right here. So first we're importing express, the core path module, and our cookie parser middleware. We're setting up our environment variables, and now we're initializing express with some global middleware. First thing we're doing is adding pug as the view engine, and also providing the location of our template files, which will be in a directory called views that we'll create. Note again that to use import.meta.dirname, you need to be using node version 20.11 or higher. Next, we're allowing express to parse JSON and also URL encoded payloads. And then we're adding our cookie parser middleware, so we can parse cookies that come in from requests and also handle them with setting them on the response. But now let's actually create this views directory that'll hold our pug templates. And we're going to have another one here, which will be our public directory, which will contain the login.html page that we're going to serve up. So I'm just going to paste inside this public directory index.html and paste in this code right here. And here, when we click this anchor tag, we will send a GET request to -api-auth.login, and we will then redirect to the Google OAuth login server. But now let's handle all this logic on Express. So back in here, underneath this right here is just a logging route. So we're going to log out the node environment, then the request method, path, and body. But let's handle the login page. So on a get to the main route, the first thing we're going to do is actually check for the presence of an ID token cookie. And we'll learn more about this in a second, but essentially this will say if the user is logged in or not. If it's not present, then we're just going to send them the login.html page. And if it is present, we're going to redirect them to their profile page. But so this is actually a good time to talk about ID tokens. So an ID token is a JWT that conforms to the OpenID Connect specification. ID tokens are decoded into information that can be used by the application to identify a user. So as an example, an ID token will look like this. So we have a header, payload, and signature, like a regular JWT. If you want to learn more on JWTs, I have quite a few videos on those, so that go more in depth. But essentially, what we will then do is we will decode this string into a JSON object like this right here. And from looking at this JSON object, we can see information about the user. So we can see the name, their email, their ID, all things like this. So now when a user logs in with Google, we'll be returned this ID token. So when they log in with the Google Auth server, we'll be returned an ID token looking like this, which we then set in a cookie, which will be this cookie right here, that we can then extract and decode into this information and see who has sent the request. And as a note, and we'll see this also later on, but ID tokens from Google are valid for 1 hour. So when they expire, we're going to use a refresh token to get a new one. But that's all I wanted to go over for ID tokens. Now what we want to do is work on a controller that handles our authentication routes. And so in our source, we're going to create a folder called controllers. And in here, we're going to create an index.js file and then an AuthController file. And once again, I'm just going to paste in what we're going to do here. So we have our AuthController, which is going to be a express router, and we're going to handle GET requests. This will be our API auth-login. And essentially, this is the route that handles the login call made from our login.html page. We're going to then use an auth service, which is a service we will create, to generate an authentication URL. This authentication URL takes the user to Google to log in. So what we generate here is going to be a URL that takes the user to the Google OAuth server. So now let's create this OAuth service. So we're going to create another directory called services, and this one is going to be called auth service.js. And once again, I'm just going to paste in some code right here and go over what's going on. So the first thing we do is we import our Google APIs library. Then we set the client ID, secret, and redirect URI as private static variables. We also add the scopes as a static variable, and these are the scopes that identify the resources our application can access on the user's behalf. So we can access their profile and also their email. All this information of what each of these returns is available on Google, or somewhere on the Google's documentation. But next, whenever we create an instance of this auth service, we're going to create an OAuth client with the Google API library. And it is this client right here that will interact with Google's OAuth 2 API. So essentially this auth service is a wrapper around the Google APIs library. And when we create an instance of our OAuth 2 client, we need to provide the client ID, our secret, and redirect URI, which are all stuff that we configured in the Google Cloud Console. But now let's focus on our generate auth URL method, which will generate the URL to take the user to the login page on Google for our application. So first thing we do is set the access type to offline, and this will tell Google to provide us with a refresh token the first time the user logs in. Setting, we then apply our scopes, which will show the user what scopes we're going to use. And then we have prompt set to consent, which makes it so the user is prompted for user consent each time they log in. So now we have it set up so when they go to this route, so in this index.html file, they'll click this right here, which will take them to this route here, which will then generate an auth URL and redirect them to it. So now they'll be at Google logging in. And it actually might be helpful a bit if I bring up this diagram over here and we can go along with what's going on. So we have our HTML page. They're going to click login with Google, which will take them to this right here. And then we're going to forward them to the auth server. So now they've logged in. Now we need to handle this redirect URI, which we configured on the Google Cloud Console. So inside our AuthController, underneath this login route, we're going to handle our cookie route, or this is our redirect route that we configured in the Google Cloud Console. First thing we're going to do is get an auth code from the query string. This authentication code is something that Google attaches, and we will use it to exchange we will exchange it for an access token, ID token, and refresh token. And we're going to do that with this method right here. Then what we do is we are setting cookies on the client containing both our refresh token and our ID token. And then we redirect the user to their profile page. And so the first thing we should do is let's create this cookie service, which will handle setting our cookies. Let me also remove a few of these. So what we're going to do is inside services, create another one called cookieservice.js. This is essentially just going to contain some static properties for setting cookies on the client. So cookie service. So here what we're doing is we're creating 3 cookies, and specifically 2 of them are for the refresh token. And this is because we want to restrict the refresh token to only being sent in the request to the logout and refresh routes. I have a video that goes in depth on refresh tokens and how to restrict them and stuff like that if you want to look for it. Just type in WittCode refresh tokens. And next thing we do is we create our ID token cookie to hold the ID token. And this ID token will expire after an hour. So we also set this expiration time down here to be an hour. And something important to note is we also have all our same site attributes set to lax right here. And this is because if we set same site to strict, then these cookies will not be sent as the request originated from Google. So we need to specify this as either lax or none, and lax is a bit more secure than none, so that's why we're using that. And now let's add, back in here we had an auth service method right here for handling our OAuth redirect. So let's create this method, and this is going to exchange an that auth code that Google sends over for an ID token, access token, and refresh token. So we're going to use our OAuth client. It has a method called getToken that we can provide an auth code to get these tokens back. And then we just return these from this method. Note how we're actually also only using the ID token and refresh token. That's because we're using just login in this video, which is why we're using the ID token to identify the user. The access token will be used to access Google's APIs, like say access Google Drive, things like that. But we're not doing that in this video. We're just doing login. So we have a refresh token to refresh the ID token, and then we just have the ID token. But now we've got that sorted. Next thing we want to do is handle our refresh tokens. So specifically, we're going to create a route that uses the refresh token to get a new ID token. So I'm going to do this inside our AuthController. Below this one, we're going to paste in this dash refresh route. So first thing we do is check if the refresh token is present on the cookie. If it isn't, we just return a 401. If it is present, then what we want to do is get a non-expired ID token. So we're going to create this method, but essentially we're going to use the refresh token to get a new ID token. And then we're going to set this ID token on the client and then send back a 200. If the refresh token is invalid, then we're going to clear it and we're going to send back a 401. And note that it is the client that should implement logic to handle the return status codes. So for example, if they get a 401 on the client, maybe they'll send them back to their profile page or to the login screen. If you get a 200 retry, then you would retry the call that failed. Once again, I have different videos that go more in depth into this, but essentially the client will handle these returned statuses. But now let's create this get new ID token method in our auth service. So beneath this, we have a function called get ID token. And what this does is it uses our Google OAuth client. It sets the refresh token as a credential, and then it uses refresh access token. And what it does is return a new set of credentials containing an ID token. So we can see how handy this OAuth client or the Google APIs library is right here for handling all this stuff for us. But now we've actually completed our AuthController. So all we need to do is add it to our Express app. And we can do that by, in this controller index.js file, let's import our controller and then export it under the -auth route. So our AuthController will handle anything going towards -auth. And then in our server, we just need to add an API route. So in our server.js file, we will just add our API route like this. Actually, I'm going to add our API route after this one right here. So now we've added our AuthController to -API-auth. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to add our authorization middleware so that we can protect certain routes, such as our logout and profile routes. So we're going to create a middleware where any routes placed before this or before it will not be protected, and any routes placed after it will be protected. So inside our server.js file, past our API right here, we are going to paste in this auth middleware. And what it does is it will extract the ID token from the cookie. If one isn't provided, we'll return a 401. And if one is provided, we're going to get the user data from this ID token. So we'll decode it to the user data. We'll set the user data onto the response locals, and then we will go to the next middleware. If we try and get the user data from the ID token and say the token is invalid, so it's been tampered with or it's expired, then we will go to this catch block where we will clear this ID token cookie and return back a 401. And this is when, say on the client, you would have some logic to try using the refresh token to get a new ID token. And if that doesn't work, then the user is just logged out. But let's create this get user data method. So inside our auth service, we're going to have a function called get user data. And once again, we can just use our Google APIs client. So there's a verify ID token method, which will verify the ID token and get the payload from it. And if this is successful, then it will just return the data. If it isn't, then it will throw an error, which is why inside our server.js, we're wrapping this in a try catch. And actually, I think I need to also, haven't done this yet, but we need to import our auth service file, which would be authservice.js at the top level here. But sweet, we're getting to the end now. So now we need to add our protected routes. And one of them is going to be our profile page. So we want to protect our profile page. We don't want to protect our login routes and our login page, of course, but we do want to protect this profile route. And so all we're going to do here is extract the user information from the response locals that we set in our auth middleware on this line right here. And then we're going to render a profile page containing this information. So let's actually create this view. So res.render will come from our pug templates. And so inside our views directory, which is right here, we will have a profile.pug. And all we have is we're going to display our Google image. We're going to say welcome to the name, specify their email, and then we have a logout route. And let's actually handle this logout now. And so of course, once again, this will be in our server file. And what I'm going to do is just have it's going to be a protected route. And it doesn't necessarily need to be, but just the way I did it, and this works. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to get the refresh token, because remember in our cookie service, we are only sending the refresh token to our refresh route and to our logout route. And so if we get that token, we're going to create an auth service, then we're going to revoke this refresh token, and then we're going to clear all our cookies and redirect them to the home page. And so of course now we need to create this revoke refresh token, which once again comes from the Google APIs library, where we can use revoke token, and we'll revoke this refresh token. But that's really essentially it to this whole thing. I'm sure there might be some bugs. First, actually, we have to listen, or get our Express app to listen. So run app.listen, and we're going to be running on our provided host and port. But all we need to do now is just hope this works. So we'll run npm start. We get a bad option, and that's because I'm not using the right version of Node. So let me use nvm. I'm going to switch to Node version 20.1.11.0. Now if we run npm start, we get controllers not defined, and that's because we need to also import our controllers like this. And we also, inside our AuthController, says we don't have a default export, and that's because at the bottom we need to export our AuthController. And sweet, okay, so now we have our server running on localhost 9001. So what I'm going to do is pull this up here, and let's visit localhost 9001, and we get another error saying cookie service is not defined, and this is all just bad imports. So let's see where cookie service is used. So we need to import our cookie service in both our server file. So import our cookie service inside our server file, and then also our AuthController. So import our cookie service here as well. Now let's try doing this again. Now it's saying we don't have a login.html file. Oh, it's because we called it index.html. So let's rename this to login. And now let's run this again. All right, so it's looking more promising now. So now we have welcome to my app. And when we click login, it should take us to the Google OAuth login server. So let's click this. And there we go. So we get redirected, continue to WittCode app. We can see the stuff that we provided inside the Google console. So let's just sign in with an email. All right, and now after signing in, we can see how it says sign into WittCode app. If we click continue, and there we go. So we've gone to our, so what happened here is, let's look in our AuthController. So we logged in, we generated this auth URL, we redirected them to Google. Then after they signed in, they were sent to this route where we got the auth code, exchanged it for an ID token, refresh token, and then redirected them to this profile page. And when we did that, because the cookies were set, we passed this authentication or authorization middleware, and we added our user data to the locals. And then in our profile, we rendered out this information. So this is all our Google information here. If we look in the console, so inside application, cookies, and we zoom in here, we can see our ID token that we set. So we have this ID token, which is used to identify us and essentially provide this information. So if we go to the main page now, we can see how we get redirected to our profile each time. Now let's see what happens if we remove this. So let's delete this cookie and let's reload our profile page. We will get an unauthorized message. And of course, this is because we're getting blocked now by this authorization middleware. So what we can do is, of course, you need to write some client-side scripts to handle this, but we would go to api-auth-refresh, and what we get set is a new ID token. So we can see our refresh token here that was sent, and now our ID token. So now if we go, now that we have a new ID token, if we go to our profile page, we can see it's worked again. But if also we can remove this token by saying, if we click log out, and when we click log out, we actually get an error. And this is because we have our path for the refresh token to be API auth logout, but we provided it inside our main server file. So what we need to do actually is move this. Forgot to do this. We need to move that into our AuthController. So at the bottom of our AuthController, move our logout route into here, and instead of app.get, use AuthController.get. And so now if we refresh this, we need to change our profile here to be -api-auth.logout. So let's go back to our profile page, and if we click logout this time, we can see how our ID token has been cleared. We no longer have a value in here, and we're back on the home page. So let's click login again, click through everything, and once again we've signed in. And now if we try and go back to the main page, we get redirected to our profile. And now when we click logout, we're back here. And we can just keep logging in. But sweet, there we go. But so this is how we can add Google Login using Express Google APIs. If you have any questions, leave them for me in the comments. If you like this video, please consider downloading my Chrome extension called WittScepter. I'll leave a link for it in the description. Just give me a good review on it. But besides that, thank you for liking and subscribing, and hope to see you in the next one. Have a good one.